So your kids don't stand a chance? Well, if they're abandoned to a system like this, left to their own devices to navigate it, their chances of surviving with their souls and minds intact may not be zero, but the chances aren't great. That's for certain. I want to begin by reflecting again on one moment in the What is a Woman trailer that we played yesterday on the show. One of the people we interviewed, Scott Nugent, is a female who, as she says, medically transitioned to appear like a male, but will never actually be a man. Now, she speaks out now quite bravely about her own horrific experiences with medical transition and warns against, most especially, the drugging and mutilation of children. In the trailer, which you can watch at whatisawoman.com, Nugent says, "It got me at 42. Your child doesn't stand a chance." And as I said yesterday, we should understand that your child doesn't understand a chance, and it referring to, gender ideology, but your child doesn't stand a chance is not meant to be a literal guarantee that all of our children are going to be indoctrinated into the trans cult against our will. We can protect our kids against that, and we must. The point is to emphasize just how powerful the forces aligned against the youngest generations actually are. We often lament that kids in school, for example, are exposed to things that only adults should be exposed to. But it's actually worse than that. They are, in fact, subjected to things that even adults are not subjected to. Actually, the adults who choose to subject our kids to these things don't want to be subjected themselves to the very same thing. So case in point, a mom this week confronted the Clark County School Board in Las Vegas about pornographic material that her daughter was forced to, wasn't just assigned to her, she was forced to memorize this and present it to her class. And listen to how the school board responds, though. Listen to this.
I'm going to read you an assignment given to my 15-year-old daughter at a local high school. This will be horrifying for me to read to you, but that will give you perspective on how she must have felt when her teacher required her to memorize this and to act it out in front of her entire class. I don't love you. It's not you. It's just, I don't like your dick, or any dick in that case. I cheated, Joe.
I'm sorry.
This is propaganda.
Forgive me. Excuse me. I don't, thank you so much for your comment. Forgive me. We're not using profanity. Are you?
Okay.
We have the time back. That's relevant.
Okay.
Yes. The teacher
this
required my daughter to memorize this and read this pornographic material.
Excuse me. Please don't engage with the audience.
Okay. Sorry,
So please continue your public comment. Your time is, you've got 1 minute and 19 seconds. I ask you simply, this is a public meeting. I ask for decorum, and I'm asking Dr. Jara. Thank you so much. Dr. Jara?
If you don't want me to read it to you, what was that like for my 15-year-old daughter to have to memorize pornographic material?
So you hear someone in the audience first cuts her off and says, "This is propaganda." It is propaganda, but it's the propaganda being given to kids in school. And immediately after, the mother there at the microphone said what you heard her say at the end, which is, if you don't want to hear it, then why are we giving it to kids? They cut her microphone. They, the adults on the school board, did not want to have to hear profanity and sexual vulgarities, but they don't mind if 15-year-old kids are exposed to it. So just think about that for a moment. There are things that kids are subjected to in schools which would be considered not only inappropriate, but potentially sometimes illegal anywhere else in society. Adults are able to say things to kids in school, make them do things that in any other context would lead to that adult being arrested. If you walked up to a child that was walking down the sidewalk and you handed her the material that the mother in that video was reading, you'd go to jail. But a teacher can assign it as a mandatory classroom activity, and the school board will take a don't ask, don't tell approach to it. I don't care if the kids have to hear that, but don't make me listen to it, they say. No, kids in school aren't being treated like adults. That would be bad enough. The actual situation is worse. Here's another example from today. Fox News reports the school board of Fairfax County Public Schools in Fairfax, Virginia, is reviewing updated rules that could potentially expose students to suspension or expulsion for, quote, maliciously misgendering their peers based on, quote, frequency and intensity. Yeah, you got to worry about the intensity of the misgendering. The Fairfax County Public Schools Students' Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, which will be voted on May 26th, includes in its updated version rules that make malicious dead naming and malicious misgendering of classmates a level 4 offense, which allows for a suspension of up to 5 days if frequency and intensity are present, according to page 19 of the document. Using slurs based upon the actual or perceived gender identity is forbidden under the rules of the document, quote, which includes but is not limited to malicious dead naming or malicious misgendering. Now, malicious misgendering may sound like the name of an indie band, but actually it refers to the crime of using a grammatically correct pronoun to refer to a gender-confused person. And dead naming, of course, means using the name their parents gave them rather than whatever name they made up for their new alter ego. This is a level 4 offense. The good news is that it's not a level 5 offense, which means that it's not quite placed on the same level as homicide and sexual assault. So Fairfax, in this way, is slightly less insane than the school district in Wisconsin that we talked about yesterday that's charging 3 boys with sexual harassment for failing to refer to a quote-unquote non-binary student with they-them pronouns. So what's happening at Fairfax is actually not as bad as what's happening in other schools. But the bad news is that level 4 puts misgendering on the same tier as assault, theft, and arson. So you could set the school on fire, and or you could refer to a boy as a he. And it's, tomato, tomato, it's the same thing. And the even worse news is that students all the way down to kindergarten will be subjected and subject to these rules and then the prescribed penalties, which include lengthy suspensions or even expulsion. This puts a moral burden on little kids in elementary school that the vast majority of adults have never had to endure. I've never had to endure. Because they're being compelled to lie under threat of immediate and severe punishment. I've never quite been in a situation like that, have you? They must choose between the truth or their academic futures. It's like a 7-year-old kid is faced with that. Very few adults have shown the resolve, fortitude, courage to stand by the truth on this issue or any other issue, even when the consequence is merely an unpleasant look or an uncomfortable interaction. Most adults have shown that they will respect the pronoun, even if they'd prefer not to, simply because they're afraid of confrontation. They're afraid of awkwardness. There could be nothing else. There could be no other potential consequence other than that. And most adults will just go along with it. How many children will have the strength to speak the truth, retain their sanity, when the consequence will be not only social alienation, but also severe administrative punishments? Now, the rule does stipulate that only malicious misgendering incidents will be punished. And this gives the kids a little leeway in case they, make the mistake of accidentally using proper grammar. Might also give them a little bit of grace if they have trouble keeping up with their classmates who have a gender identity that changes 5 times a day. But if it's decided that proper grammar was used intentionally, God forbid, then the consequences will be swift and dire. Now, when I was a kid, students with a demonstrable grasp on the rules of grammar were awarded with high grades and little encouraging stickers on their assignments. Now those students are expelled. And how will the administration even know if the misgendering was intentional or not? Well, that'll be up to their kangaroo courts to determine. Of course, malicious and intentional are seen as one and the same here. It's been decided that the only reason why anybody would ever intentionally use male pronouns when referring to a male who wants to be a female is that they're trying to hurt the person. The possibility that somebody would misgender, i.e. correctly gender, not because they want to hurt anybody, but because they value the truth and because they realize that cooperating with and affirming confusion only causes more harm to the confused individual, that possibility is discounted. Doesn't exist as far as the Fairfax schools are concerned. Now, the effect here is, first and foremost, of course, that kids are mentally beaten into submission until they finally accept the tenets of gender ideology, not because they understand the tenets or believe them, but because they're afraid, understandably afraid, and they lack the energy or the will to deal with the consequences of not accepting what they're being told to accept. But another effect just as intentional, but less often discussed, is that kids are being turned against each other. Terry Schilling of the Claremont Institute made this point on Twitter about this story. I thought it was a good point, that these kinds of policies are, on top of everything else, yet another way to sow division and suspicion and resentment within the student population, among the kids themselves. It's announced from on high that any student who intentionally fails to use preferred pronouns is malicious and deserving of the harshest possible penalties. This is a message and word of warning, not just to those heretical students, but to all the other kids as well. It's a big red arrow pointed at the heretics saying, these people are bad. They hate you. You should hate them too. That's the announcement. Don't try to see the best in people. Don't give any grace. Don't try to understand things from their perspective. Oh no, not that. No, if they don't do what you want them to do, report them to the authorities and destroy their lives. That's the message. The environment that's fostered. So your kids don't stand a chance? Well, if they're abandoned to a system like this, left to their own devices to navigate it, their chances of surviving with their souls and minds intact may not be zero, but the chances aren't great. That's for certain. Hey, listen, hit the subscribe button. Do it right now. I demand it, and I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.